I found someone better. You'll manage. You always do." The words hit me like a sledgehammer wrapped in silk, delivered with the casual cruelty of someone discarding yesterday's newspaper. 7 years of marriage, 3 years of motherhood, and he was ending it all with the emotional investment of someone canceling a subscription. Our kitchen counter, where we'd shared morning coffee and late-night conversations about Jake's future, became the stage for my execution. He slid his wedding ring across the granite like he was paying for groceries, the metallic scrape echoing through our house with the finality of a coffin lid closing. "I'm taking the good car," he added, because destroying my heart wasn't enough. He needed to strand me with a toddler and a Honda with 200,000 miles that made grinding noises every time I turned left. 3-year-old Jake was building Lego castles in the living room, his innocent laughter the soundtrack to his father walking away forever. That little boy had no idea his daddy was choosing a 24-year-old marketing assistant over the family they'd built together. But what my husband didn't know, what he couldn't see behind my tear-stained face and shaking hands, was that he'd just made the biggest tactical error of his life. "My name is Abigail Rodriguez. I'm 36 years old, mother of a 3-year-old boy named Jake, and the man who vowed till death do us part chose a 24-year-old marketing assistant over the family we'd built together." Less than a week after he moved out, taking the good car and half our savings to fund his midlife crisis, I found myself sitting across from his parents in their Westchester dining room, surrounded by crystal that cost more than my monthly salary and judgment that came free with their Sunday pot roast. Margaret Rodriguez sat at the head of their mahogany table, like a queen holding court, her pearls catching the light from a chandelier that had probably witnessed 3 generations of family cruelty. Her husband Robert flanked her right side, his gold Rolex glinting as he cut his meat with surgical precision, both of them radiating the kind of confidence that comes from never having to question whether you'll make rent. "Well, Abigail," Margaret said, her voice carrying the particular poison that only comes from women who've married into money and forgotten what it felt like to earn respect, "I suppose you'll be moving back with your mother now." It wasn't a question. It was a verdict delivered by people who'd spent 7 years tolerating me as their son's wife, and were now free to express their true assessment of my worth. "A single mom will never achieve anything on her own," Robert added, dabbing his mouth with a linen napkin that probably cost more than Jake's monthly daycare fee. "You'll come crawling back within 6 months, begging David to take you back." Their laughter was sharp as breaking glass, echoing off walls lined with family portraits where I'd never quite belonged. 7 years of Christmas mornings and birthday dinners, and I'd always been the outsider looking in, the daughter-in-law who wasn't quite good enough for their precious son. "David's already talking about introducing us to his new girlfriend," Margaret continued, twisting the knife with the practiced cruelty of someone who'd perfected emotional surgery over 6 decades. "She's an MBA, you know. Very ambitious. Very suitable." Suitable. The word hung in the air like smoke from a gun that had just fired. I excused myself and locked the bathroom door, staring at my reflection in a mirror that showed me exactly what they saw: a woman whose eyes were red-rimmed from crying, whose lips were cracked from stress, whose face carried the exhaustion of someone trying to hold together a life that was falling apart in real time. But what they couldn't see, what the mirror couldn't capture, was the spine that refused to bend under the weight of their expectations. As I drove home in my Honda with the grinding transmission, Jake sleeping in his car seat behind me, my mind drifted back to a moment from 17 years earlier. I was 19, sitting in Professor Martinez's business class at community college, presenting a small business idea I'd been developing: handmade jewelry sold online, back when e-commerce was still a revolutionary concept. "You're smart, Abigail," he'd said after my presentation, his voice carrying the patronizing tone of someone who'd confused dreams with delusions, but dreams don't pay bills. "You need to think practically about your future." I dropped the business class the next week, convinced that practical people like professors knew better than dreamers like me about what was possible in the real world. Tonight, driving through suburbs where every house represented the kind of stability that had just been ripped away from Jake and me, those words echoed again, louder than the radio, louder than the grinding transmission, louder than my own doubts about whether I was strong enough to do this alone. My apartment in White Plains felt smaller when I carried Jake inside, his 3-year-old body warm and trusting against my shoulder. The bills were spread across our kitchen table like accusations: rent, utilities, car payment, daycare, groceries, student loans from the degree that was supposed to guarantee financial security, but had instead guaranteed debt that would follow me for decades. I did the math 3 times, hoping the numbers would somehow rearrange themselves into something manageable. But mathematics doesn't care about hope, and the brutal truth was that my salary as a marketing coordinator barely covered our basic expenses, let alone the emergency fund that every financial advisor said was essential for single mothers. Jake's soft breathing drifted from his bedroom, the sound of someone who trusted completely that his mother would figure out how to keep their small world safe. That trust was heavier than any responsibility I'd ever carried, more terrifying than any challenge I'd ever faced. In the silence that followed my calculations, surrounded by evidence of how precarious our situation had become, I let myself break, really break, for the first and last time since David had walked out. I cried for the marriage that had died slowly over months of growing distance and casual cruelty. I cried for the financial security that had evaporated with his departure. I cried for Jake, who would grow up in a broken home because his father had decided that love was conditional on convenience. But mostly I cried for the woman I'd been before I'd learned to make myself smaller, quieter, more acceptable to people who would never accept me, regardless of how much I diminished myself to fit their expectations. The tears lasted exactly 23 minutes. I timed them, because giving in to despair was a luxury I couldn't afford for longer than that. When they stopped, something had shifted inside my chest, crystallizing like steel being forged in fire. Tomorrow, I swore to the silence and the bills and the sleeping child who was depending on me to be stronger than I'd ever been, I would rebuild. Not just our financial situation or our living circumstances, but the version of myself that had existed before I'd learned to apologize for taking up space in rooms where other people made decisions about what was possible. The woman who'd pitched business ideas at 19 hadn't disappeared. She'd just been buried under 7 years of being told that practical was more important than possible. It was time to dig her up. The alarm shrieked at 4:30 a.m. every morning, cutting through dreams I barely had time to form. I'd slip out of bed like a ghost, leaving Jake sleeping with his stuffed dinosaur, and transform myself into someone who could smile at truckers demanding coffee refills and construction workers making comments about my legs. The uniform for Mickey's Diner was polyester pink, with a name tag that said Abby because the owner thought Abigail was too fancy for a waitress. I'd apply lipstick in my car's rearview mirror, using Revlon Red to hide the exhaustion that had become my permanent complexion, then spend 6 hours serving eggs over easy to people who left 50-cent tips and assumptions about what single mothers deserved. Every morning, I'd leave a note by Jake's cereal bowl, the same generic brand Cheerios because name brands were a luxury I couldn't justify, written in purple marker because it was his favorite color. Mommy loves you. Mrs. Patterson will pick you up for daycare. Be good. The diner shift ended at 11 a.m., which gave me exactly 37 minutes to drive across White Plains to Westchester Feuds, where I'd clock in as a grocery clerk for the afternoon shift. Different uniform, same smile, different kind of exhaustion as I bagged groceries for families buying organic produce I couldn't afford and premium cuts of meat that cost more than my daily earnings. Paper or plastic became my mantra, repeated thousands of times while my feet screamed in shoes that were falling apart and my back ached from bending over shopping carts filled with abundance I could only dream about. The grocery shift ended at 6 p.m., which meant a frantic drive to pick up Jake from daycare before they started charging late fees that could destroy my weekly budget. Dinner was usually mac and cheese from a box, eaten while he told me about his day, and I pretended I had energy left to engage with his 3-year-old enthusiasm about everything. But the real work started after Jake went to bed. I'd set up my broken laptop on our kitchen table, the same Dell I'd bought for college that now had a cracked screen and a keyboard missing the H key, and dive into freelance typing jobs that paid $12 an hour when I could find them. Medical transcriptions, legal documents, student dissertations written by people who could afford to pay someone else to type their thoughts. My hands were a roadmap of survival, cracked from washing dishes at the diner, dried out from sanitizer at the grocery store, stained with ink from constantly clicking broken pens. But every blister was proof that I was fighting, every crack evidence that I wasn't giving up. The typing work usually lasted until midnight, sometimes later if deadlines demanded it. Jake would sometimes wake up and find me there, hunched over the laptop with my neck twisted at angles that would hurt for days, typing other people's words while my own dreams gathered dust. "Mommy, why are you always working?" He'd ask in that innocent voice that could break hearts and build determination in the same breath. "I'm trying to make our life better, sweetheart," I'd whisper, pulling him onto my lap and inhaling the scent of his shampoo that smelled like hope mixed with Johnson's baby wash. Someday, things will be different. But late nights and cracked hands weren't the hardest part. The hardest part was the calculation I did every Sunday evening, sitting at that kitchen table surrounded by receipts and bills, trying to make numbers that would never add up somehow stretch to cover another week of survival. Rent, $1,200. Daycare, $800. Groceries, $200 if I was careful, $250 if Jake needed anything extra. Gas, $120. Car payment, $180. Utilities, $150. Health insurance, $340. The math was brutal and unforgiving. Even working 3 jobs, I was barely breaking even, living paycheck to paycheck with no room for emergencies, no cushion for the unexpected expenses that single mothers know are always lurking around the corner. That's when I started experimenting. Late nights after the typing work was done, when Jake was sleeping and the apartment was quiet except for the humming refrigerator and distant traffic, I'd research online businesses. Not the get-rich-quick schemes that promised unrealistic returns, but real companies started by real people who'd found ways to create income from skills they already possessed. I remembered the jewelry-making hobby I'd abandoned after Professor Martinez had convinced me that dreams didn't pay bills. 17 years later, sitting in an apartment I could barely afford with a son depending on me to figure out survival, I realized that bills didn't pay themselves either. I started small. Handmade scarves knitted while watching late-night television after Jake went to bed. Nothing fancy, just soft acrylic yarn in colors that reminded me of hope, blues and greens and purples that felt like possibility. I'd photograph them with my phone against our kitchen window where the morning light was brightest, then list them on Etsy with descriptions written during my lunch breaks at the grocery store. The first week, nothing sold. The second week, nothing sold. The third week, I started to wonder if Margaret Rodriguez had been right about single mothers and their limitations. Then, on a Tuesday evening while I was heating up Jake's dinosaur-shaped chicken nuggets, my phone pinged with a notification that would change everything. "You have a new sale. PayPal payment of $20 has been received." $20. Less than I made in 2 hours at the diner, but it might as well have been 20,000. I cried right there in the kitchen, holding my phone like it was made of gold, while Jake asked why Mommy was sad when the nuggets were ready. "I'm not sad, baby," I whispered, wiping tears that tasted like vindication. "I'm happy. Someone just bought something Mommy made." It wasn't the money that made me cry, though $20 meant we could buy name-brand cereal that week. It was the realization that this payment was different from every other dollar I'd earned since David left. This money was mine. Created by my hands, my ideas, my willingness to try something that terrified me. Nobody had hired me, supervised me, or decided I was worth exactly minimum wage plus occasional tips. For the first time in months, I'd created value, instead of just trading time for money. $20 became 40, became 75. Word-of-mouth referrals from customers who loved their scarves. Custom orders for specific colors and patterns. Reviews that said things like, "beautiful work and fast shipping and will definitely buy again." The laptop stayed on the kitchen table, but now it was running 2 businesses, freelance typing that paid the immediate bills, and a growing online store that whispered promises about futures I'd stopped allowing myself to imagine. Margaret Rodriguez had said single mothers never achieved anything. Professor Martinez had said dreams didn't pay bills. But neither of them had accounted for what happened when someone with nothing left to lose discovered she had everything to gain. Within 6 months, my apartment had transformed from a place of survival into a warehouse of ambition. Cardboard boxes stacked to the ceiling like towers of possibility, filled with yarn, shipping labels, bubble wrap, and dreams that were finally taking physical form. Jake, now almost 4, had appointed himself my official delivery man, running between boxes with the enthusiasm that only children bring to watching their mothers rebuild their lives from scratch. His laughter echoed off walls lined with inventory as he pretended to sort orders and organize shipping supplies, turning our living room into his personal playground of entrepreneurial chaos. "Mommy, this box goes to Texas," he'd announce, pointing to a package wrapped in brown paper and held together with tape I'd bought in bulk from Costco. "That's really far away." I didn't just pack those boxes, I packed dignity back into my name. Every scarf carefully folded in tissue paper, every handwritten thank you note, every shipping label printed with Rodriguez handmade was proof that single mothers could build something beautiful from the wreckage of broken promises. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday that started like any other disaster. My Etsy shop had been growing steadily, 50 scarves a week, then 75, then over 100, but I'd underestimated demand for my new winter collection. Custom infinity scarves in jewel tones that caught light like stained glass windows, each one taking 4 hours to complete on weekends when Jake was visiting his father. I'd listed 25 scarves at 8 p.m. on Sunday evening. By Wednesday morning, they were sold out, and my inbox was flooded with messages from customers asking when more would be available. "Beautiful work," wrote Sarah from Oregon. "Exactly as described. Even softer than I expected. Fast shipping and gorgeous colors," added Maria from Florida. "Already planning my next order." The reviews kept coming. 5-star ratings from strangers who'd never met me but were cheering me on from across the country. Women who understood what it meant to support other women trying to build something meaningful. But success brought complications I hadn't anticipated. My days split into 2 completely different existences. Daytime Abigail still clocked in at Westchester Feuds, wearing the same polyester smock and plastic smile, scanning barcodes and bagging groceries while customers complained about prices I had no control over. The woman who said paper or plastic for 8 hours was tired, invisible, existing solely to facilitate other people's convenience. But nighttime Abigail was fierce, focused, typing until dawn with eyes lit by laptop screen glow and possibilities that expanded with every order notification. This version of me researched wholesale yarn suppliers, optimized SEO keywords, studied inventory management, and learned accounting software that made my head spin but my bank account grow. The contrast was jarring. Servant by day, entrepreneur by night, mother always. Then the obstacles hit like a freight train designed to test exactly how badly I wanted this new life. First, my website crashed during a holiday promotion, losing 3 days' worth of orders and leaving customers furious about missing out on advertised discounts. The hosting company blamed unexpected traffic like it was my fault that people actually wanted to buy what I was selling. Then shipping delays during Christmas season meant packages arriving late, customers demanding refunds, and negative reviews that felt like personal attacks on everything I'd been building. One particularly brutal review called my business unprofessional and suggested I stick to hobbies instead of pretending to run a real company. Every failure whispered Margaret Rodriguez's words, "You'll never make it. Single moms always overestimate their capabilities." The temptation to quit was overwhelming. 3 jobs were killing me slowly. Jake needed more attention than I could give, and the stress of managing inventory while working retail was turning my hair gray at 36. But instead of collapsing, I made a decision that would define everything that came next. I reinvested. Every dollar that would have gone toward moving to a better apartment or buying Jake toys that weren't secondhand went back into the business. Professional web hosting that could handle traffic spikes. Inventory management software that tracked every skein of yarn. A business phone number that made Rodriguez Handmade sound like a real company instead of a side hustle. I read everything: business blogs, e-commerce guides, marketing strategies, customer service protocols. Barnes & Noble became my business school, Jake coloring in the children's section while I studied entrepreneurship textbooks I couldn't afford to buy. The failures stopped feeling like defeats and started feeling like education. Every crashed website taught me about backup systems. Every delayed shipment taught me about buffer time and supplier reliability. Every angry customer taught me about communication and expectation management. Most importantly, I stopped viewing my limitations as permanent conditions and started seeing them as temporary obstacles that required creative solutions. The grocery store job wasn't just survival, it was market research. I watched how products were displayed, how customers made purchasing decisions, how successful brands presented themselves. Every shift became a masterclass in retail psychology taught by people who had no idea they were my professors. The diner job wasn't just exhausting work, it was customer service training. I learned how to handle difficult people with grace, how to exceed expectations with small gestures, how to make every interaction memorable in positive ways. The late-night typing wasn't just freelance income, it was writing practice. Every medical transcription improved my attention to detail. Every legal document taught me about contracts and business language. Every college dissertation helped me understand how successful people communicated complex ideas. By the time Jake turned 4, Rodriguez Handmade was generating more monthly income than my day jobs combined. But more important than the money was what I'd learned about myself in the process. I wasn't the woman David had abandoned because she was too weak to handle life alone. I wasn't the woman Margaret Rodriguez had dismissed as incapable of achievement. I was someone who could turn failure into fuel, obstacles into opportunities, and other people's doubts into motivation that burned brighter than any encouragement ever could. The apartment might have looked like chaos to outside observers, a single mother trying to balance too many responsibilities in too small a space. But to me, it looked like the launching pad for everything Margaret Rodriguez had said I'd never be capable of achieving. And we were just getting started. The storage unit on Route 9 smelled like cardboard and possibility. 50 square feet of concrete and fluorescent lighting that became my first real office, where Rodriguez Handmade transformed from a kitchen table operation into something that required actual business infrastructure. I'd rented the unit for $89 a month when my apartment could no longer hold the inventory, the shipping supplies, and Jake's need for space to be a normal 4-year-old. What started as overflow storage became command central, a folding table for my laptop, plastic drawers for organized supplies, and a space heater that barely worked during New York winters. The growth was relentless, almost violent in its intensity. One employee became 5 when I could no longer pack orders while working day jobs and sleeping 4 hours a night. Maria, a single mother from my neighborhood, started part-time doing fulfillment. Then Carmen joined for customer service. Lisa handled inventory. Each hire was another risk, another mouth to feed from revenue that felt simultaneously growing and fragile. 5 employees became 15 when we expanded beyond scarves into a full line of handmade accessories. 15 became 30 when we added home goods. 30 became 50 when we launched our own manufacturing partnerships with small factories in North Carolina that shared my commitment to American-made quality. I devoured knowledge like someone starving. Business books, marketing courses, logistics seminars, branding workshops, anything that could teach me how to scale without losing the personal touch that had built our customer loyalty. The same cracked laptop with tape holding the hinge together became my weapon of war, the tool I used to research competitors, analyze market trends, and build systems that could support growth I'd never imagined possible. Midnight oil wasn't just burned, it was incinerated. Jake would find me at the kitchen table at 6 a.m., still in the same clothes from the day before, surrounded by spreadsheets and vendor contracts and expansion plans that made my head spin with their complexity. "Mommy, you look tired," he'd say, with the innocent concern of a child who was watching his mother build an empire but didn't understand why it required such sacrifice. "I'm not tired, sweetheart," I'd lie, pulling him onto my lap and inhaling his sleepy child's scent. "I'm excited. We're building something amazing." But building something amazing required capital that banks weren't interested in providing to single mothers with unconventional business models. The meeting at Westchester National Bank was designed to humble me back into my assigned place in their lending hierarchy. William Patterson sat behind a desk that probably cost more than my monthly revenue, wearing a suit that whispered "serious banker" and an expression that suggested he'd already made his decision before I'd finished explaining my business plan. "Miss Rodriguez," he said, shuffling through my application with the enthusiasm of someone reviewing municipal tax codes, "your revenue growth island, impressive. But you're asking for significant capital without traditional collateral." I'd prepared for this objection, bringing 3 years of financial statements, customer testimonials, market analysis, and growth projections that painted Rodriguez Handmade as a company worth investing in. "Our customer retention rate is 92%, I explained, leaning forward with the intensity of someone whose child's future depended on this conversation. "Our profit margins are 38% higher than industry standard. We've never missed a payment to vendors, employees, or creditors." Patterson's expression suggested he was listening to a child explain why she deserved a bigger allowance. "The reality is, you're too small to qualify for our commercial lending programs, and frankly, too risky for our small business initiatives. Single mother-owned businesses have a higher failure rate, and our risk assessment indicates—" "Stop." The word came out sharper than I'd intended, cutting through his practiced rejection like a blade through paper. "I don't need your risk assessment. I need capital to grow a business that's already succeeding despite every obstacle you people have put in my path. His eyebrows rose like I'd just committed some breach of banking etiquette. I understand you're disappointed, but our lending criteria are designed to protect wealth, not create it, I interrupted, gathering my papers with movements that felt like declaring war. You want to lend money to people who already have money. I want to build something that matters. I stood up, feeling the weight of every rejection I'd faced since David left, every dismissive comment from his parents, every assumption that single mothers were too fragile for serious business. Then I'll build it without you. The same cracked laptop that had started this journey became the platform for our next phase. Instead of traditional bank loans, I turned to revenue-based financing from investors who understood e-commerce growth. Instead of conforming to conventional retail models, we went direct to consumer with subscription boxes and personalized services that big companies couldn't replicate. Every rejection became fuel. Every obstacle became an opportunity to prove that small businesses run by determined women could outmaneuver corporations with unlimited resources and limited imagination. The $1 million milestone hit on a Tuesday in March, 18 months after the bank meeting that had tried to end my expansion dreams. I was in the storage unit that had grown into a 3,000 square foot warehouse, surrounded by employees who'd become family, when the notification appeared on my phone. Monthly revenue, $1,127,493. 7 figures. More money than David made in his best year at the consulting firm. More than his parents had probably expected any woman in their family to earn, especially one they'd written off as destined for failure. I didn't celebrate immediately. First, I called Jake's school to tell them I'd be late for pickup. Then I sat in my car in the warehouse parking lot and cried, not from exhaustion or stress or fear, but from the overwhelming realization that I'd actually done it. Rodriguez Handmade had become Rodriguez Industries. The single mother who was too small and too risky for bank loans was now running a $1 million company that employed 57 people and served customers in all 50 states. That evening, Jake found me at the kitchen table again, but this time I wasn't hunched over paperwork. I was sitting straight, looking at financial statements that proved every person who'd underestimated me had been catastrophically wrong. "Did something good happen, Mommy?" he asked, climbing onto my lap with the intuition that children have about their parents' emotional states. "Something very good happened," I said, holding him close. "We proved that dreams do pay bills, baby. They pay bills and then some." Margaret Rodriguez's whispers had turned to stunned silence. The in-laws who'd predicted my failure were now hearing about my success through family gossip networks that couldn't ignore a $1 million revenue announcement. But the sweetest victory wasn't the money or the recognition or the proof that I'd exceeded every expectation. It was knowing that Jake was growing up watching his mother refuse to accept other people's limitations as permanent conditions. And we weren't finished yet. The acquisition paperwork arrived on a Monday, like destiny collecting a debt 3 years overdue. Rodriguez Industries was no longer just scarves and accessories. It had grown into a full e-commerce empire, home goods, fashion lines, custom manufacturing, and a subscription service with 200,000 customers nationwide. But the true milestone came with acquiring a failing asset that would redefine my story. The boardroom on the 40th floor of the Meridian building was glass and steel, a place where money spoke louder than people. My attorney, Jennifer Walsh, slid the final papers across the polished mahogany table. Rodriguez Industries acquires Davidson Consulting Group. Purchase price, $2.3 million, she announced. Davidson Consulting Group. The company my ex-husband had built with family connections, the one that had once represented everything I supposedly couldn't have. Now it belonged to me. There was no champagne, no victory dance, just stillness. The quiet realization that the woman who once packed boxes in a storage unit now signed checks that could buy entire companies. The girl David had abandoned was gone. In her place sat a CEO of a $47 million company. 3 days later, the real moment of satisfaction arrived. "Miss Rodriguez," my assistant said cautiously, "someone is here to see you. He says it's personal." David stood in my doorway. His hair was thinner, his face pale, his frame worn down by months of stress. The confident man who once told me I'd manage without him now looked like a shadow of himself. "Abigail," he said, my name trembling in his mouth. Thank you for seeing me. I didn't invite him to sit. I didn't offer coffee. I let him stand there, surrounded by the proof of everything he never believed I could achieve. The awards, the floor-to-ceiling windows, the financial reports on my desk. I heard about the acquisition, he said slowly. My company, the one I used to own. You mean the company I now own? I corrected. His face went pale. The empire he built on privilege had been absorbed by the empire I built on resilience. Abigail, please, he whispered. I need help. Alone. Something to get back on my feet. For old time's sake. For old time's sake. As if betrayal could be collateral. I opened my desk drawer and pulled out the wedding ring he'd left on the kitchen counter 3 years earlier. Not for sentiment, but as a reminder of the day I learned that worth is something you prove to yourself, not to anyone else. I placed the ring on the desk between us. This belonged to a woman who believed marriage was partnership, I said evenly. Who thought supporting her husband's dreams meant he'd support hers. That woman died the day you walked out. That. David's eyes locked on the ring like it was evidence at his trial. She was replaced by someone who learned abandonment wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something greater. Abigail, I made mistakes. No, I cut in. You made choices. You chose someone you thought was better. You chose to leave me to manage alone. And you chose to believe I'd crawl back. The silence was heavy. The day you left was the day I learned I would never need you again. Oh, I slid the ring back into the drawer, not as a memory of loss, but as proof of the moment I stopped measuring myself by who stayed. David left quietly, as he had before. But this time I wasn't the one left behind. I was the one who'd built something so strong that his absence had turned into my greatest gift. The woman who once cried over unpaid bills was now signing million-dollar checks. And that transformation was worth far more than any marriage that required me to stay small so someone else could feel big. The press conference announcing Rodriguez Industries' acquisition of Davidson Consulting Group felt like standing at the center of a lightning storm made of camera flashes and shouted questions from reporters who suddenly cared about the single mother they'd never noticed before. Miss Rodriguez, how does it feel to acquire your ex-husband's company? What's next for Rodriguez Industries? Any comment on your company's $47 million valuation? I stood behind the podium at the Westchester Marriott, wearing a navy suit that had been custom-tailored because off-the-rack clothes weren't designed for women who'd built their own empires. But it wasn't the reporters or the cameras or the industry recognition that made this moment significant. It was Jake, now 7 years old, standing beside me in his first real suit, navy blue to match mine, his small hand resting on the podium, like he belonged in rooms where million-dollar decisions were announced to people whose job was to explain success to audiences who'd never attempted it. He'd grown up watching his mother transform from someone who cried over unpaid bills into someone who wrote checks that employed 340 people across 3 states. His normal wasn't other kids' normal, but it was better. It was watching resilience in action instead of just hearing about it in bedtime stories. The acquisition represents more than financial growth, I said into the microphone, looking out at faces that reflected the same skepticism I'd faced from bank managers and in-laws who'd written me off as incapable of achievement. It represents the power of refusing to accept other people's limitations as permanent conditions. In my hands, I held Rodriguez Industries' annual report, 127 pages of financial statements, growth projections, and employee testimonials that read like love letters to a company built on the radical idea that treating people well was good business. The report felt substantial, weighty, like a crown forged from ashes and determination, and midnight oil burned while everyone else was sleeping. When I started this company 3 years ago, I continued, feeling Jake's eyes on me as I spoke about the journey he'd witnessed firsthand. I wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone else. I was trying to prove to myself that abandonment doesn't define capability, that starting over doesn't mean starting smaller. The questions kept coming, but I could see understanding dawning on faces that had expected a different kind of story. They'd come expecting revenge narrative. Woman destroys ex, husband's business out of spite. Instead, they were hearing about something more complex and ultimately more powerful. Success hadn't been about revenge. Revenge was temporary, satisfying for a moment but ultimately hollow. Success had been about building something so meaningful that David's abandonment became irrelevant to the story, a footnote in a chapter about what happened when someone refused to stay broken. The greatest victory, I said, looking directly into cameras that would carry this moment to audiences who might be facing their own abandonments, their own moments of being told they weren't enough, isn't proving your enemies wrong. It's proving to yourself that their opinion of your worth was never accurate in the first place. After the reporters left and the cameras stopped rolling, Jake and I walked through the parking lot toward the BMW I'd bought, not because I needed to impress anyone, but because single mothers deserved reliable transportation that didn't make grinding noises when they turned left. "Mommy," Jake said, his 7-year-old voice cutting through the evening air with the clarity that only children bring to complex adult emotions. "Are you sad about Daddy's company?" I knelt down to his level, looking into eyes that held David's curiosity, but had been shaped by watching his mother refuse to surrender to circumstances that were designed to break her. "I'm not sad, sweetheart. I'm grateful. Grateful that his company failed. Grateful that his leaving taught me something I never would have learned if he'd stayed." "What did it teach you?" I thought about the woman I'd been 3 years ago, someone who'd measured her worth by her husband's willingness to stay, who'd apologized for taking up space in rooms where decisions were made, who'd believed that love meant making yourself small so someone else could feel important. It taught me that I was never as weak as people thought, and I was always stronger than I knew. We walked toward the car together, Jake's small hand in mine, both of us heading home to the house I'd bought in a neighborhood where success was measured by what you'd built instead of what you'd inherited. The city lights blazed around us as we drove through Westchester County, past the bank that had refused to lend me money, past the apartment where I'd once cried over bills, past the diner where I'd served coffee to people who'd never bothered to learn my name. None of those places defined me anymore. None of those limitations were permanent conditions. They tried to bury me with humiliation, dismissal, and assumptions about what single mothers were capable of achieving. But I'd grown roots in that darkness, drawn strength from soil that had been fertilized by their doubt and watered by my own tears. I wasn't the abandoned woman anymore. I wasn't the struggling single mother. I wasn't the employee who could be dismissed when family obligations became inconvenient for corporate profits. I was the CEO of a company that proved every day that success belonged to people who refused to accept other people's assessment of their limitations. I was the mother raising a son who would never question whether he deserved to take up space in rooms where important decisions were made. I was the woman who'd learned that the most powerful response to abandonment wasn't revenge or bitterness or even forgiveness. It was becoming so successful that the person who'd left you realized they'd made the biggest mistake of their life, while you realized their leaving had been the best thing that ever happened to yours. Not abandoned. Not forgotten. Not broken. Abigail's story isn't just about business success or entrepreneurial revenge. It's about the moment you stop measuring your worth by other people's willingness to stay and start building something so meaningful that their departure becomes irrelevant to your story. If this story reminded you of your own journey from rock bottom to breakthrough, if it made you think about someone whose potential has been underestimated because of their circumstances, hit that like button and subscribe. Turn on notifications because next week we're exploring another story about quiet strength and explosive transformation. Share this with someone who needs to remember that being abandoned doesn't mean you're not worthy of love. It means you're strong enough to build a life so fulfilling that you stop needing other people's approval to feel complete. Remember, they can walk away from your potential, but they can't walk away from your results. And sometimes the greatest gift someone can give you is showing you that you never needed them as much as you thought you did. Until next time, keep building something so amazing that their leaving becomes the best decision they never meant to make for you.